introducing us to the upward mobility framework and the work that we're doing through all of our partners with indicators. It really gives us a chance to be more deliberate in raising household income potential along with diversified, affordable housing. And as we know, there's no one single answer to support economic development, stability, and growth. But what we've learned is by looking at it through this logic model and systemic change that we could really have an impact on our whole community, on our neighborhoods, and on individuals and the way they live within, within our region. And it can be tailored to each localities and what their circumstances are, what their needs are. And we're here to be a resource to help you help yourselves. So I want to talk about the session purpose. Fostering diverse housing types in the community can help us address the challenges of housing shortage, which we've not really caught up from the 2008-9 downturn. And that results in a greater stress on housing affordability. People aren't moving on to the next stage. We're not, it's just pushing at both ends. Outmoded and inflexible zoning can stifle new forms of housing, mixed uses, mixed income opportunities in housing that really more closely reflect the way we live, work, and play. We've changed as a population, and we've changed through COVID how we work and how we go to school. So this panel, we're going to feature the best practice examples from Charlottesville and Alexandria and other places in Northern Virginia, and our own localities in the region, to help us rethink how we can be more deliberate in creating greater diversity in housing that serve all people, families, and incomes more effectively. And our speakers are going to address a wide spectrum of possible solutions. They can be layered in different ways to meet the needs and characteristics of each locality. They're going to range from holistic or partial zoning reforms to public education and public and private partnerships to invest and incentivize housing to achieve racial equity and social mobility through housing. We really are aiming to educate ourselves on what are the challenges. Can we give you the data that shows that and justifies grant funding or other sources of funding? What are the possibilities? What are some other localities doing? What are our own localities doing that we can model ourselves across the region? And we want to focus on the practical realities and further the regional conversation through enriching dialogue and Q&A today. We're hoping to spend just half the time with our presentations. Each of our speakers will have about 8 to 10 minutes. We're going to talk first at the state level, then the regional level, regional perspective, and then the two locality examples. So I'm really looking forward to this and hope that you all will have some good questions as a result. So Chris Thompson.
All right, thank you, Barbara. So Chris Thompson, go by he and him. And I just want to thank you, Barbara and Martha, and all the PlanRVA staff for just bringing us here today. It's been a fantastic day, and thank all of you for sticking around, because I think this last session is going to be really thought-provoking, give you some good ideas about what's working in other communities, and also give us a chance to be some cheerleaders for some of this work that's happening. So to talk about what our panel looks like today, so I'm going to give a little bit of that statewide perspective, then going to hand it off to Javon Burton. A lot of you already know Javon and his work as the Executive Director for the Partnership for Housing Affordability. From there, we're going to hear from Christina Stacy, Principal Research Associate at Urban Institute. And then wrapping things up is going to be Dan Rosenzweig, who is the CEO and President of Habitat for Humanity in Greater Charlottesville. So got a great lineup for you today. We're going to leave lots of time for questions, because I'm sure you're going to have a lot of good thoughts for us as we roll into this. Do a little information period first around who we are. So Virginia Housing, we are the State Housing Finance Agency, kind of one of those weird quasi-governmental entities that, we raise our own funds. We don't really receive state funding, but we still fall, kind of under the administration's purview. Our job is all about housing. A lot of folks know us because of work we do to create home ownership opportunities. We've got programs that help with down payment assistance, closing cost assistance, rate buy downs, housing education. And then also we work really heavily in the rental space. So a lot of the activity you see around Richmond, for example, we help to finance because there's an affordable housing component. And then we also just spend a lot of time out in the field. We cover everywhere from the Eastern Shore, coal fields, Northern Virginia, South Side. And we do that because we try to, connect people to resources, figure out how we can help problem solve, and also take that feedback so that we can figure out how we can be better partners. So we spend a lot of time, doing that kind of community engagement work. To give you an idea of some state observations, and I'll start with the gloomy part of this first. So we're still crunching our 2024 information. So we don't really know all of our production information yet, but I'll give you the past 2 years because I think it really is reflective of the market that we're in. So I'll start at the bottom. So FY22, we had a great year in terms of lending, volume, creating home ownership. So we financed over 5,700 rental units that year, and lending was about 800 million. So really good numbers. On the home ownership side, we had 77 loans to help with mortgages for home ownership, and almost 2 billion in lending for that. So almost 2 billion in mortgages for home ownership. Move into 2023. Different picture, different market. So our rental financing was down from 5,700 to 2,800 units, and our lending was down from 800 million to just under 500 million. And on the home ownership side, we went from 7,700 loans down to 3,800 loans. So if you look across the board, 40-50% reduction in volume. And we all know why. We talk about this all the time. The inflation around materials, the difficulty in finding materials, difficulty in finding contract labor, the entitlement process, going through rezoning. I'm sure Dan can speak to this. It's extraordinarily time intensive and also very costs a lot of money. And then, there's the cost to do business, whether you're getting a mortgage or you're building something, the construction financing, permanent financing, all of that has created challenges for us. And it's not just in the Richmond area, and I know, Javon's gonna give a lot of really good data about, what that landscape looks like in the metro area. But, this is, information we see across Virginia. And so if there are anyone from Association of Realtors, thank you so much, y'all do great work. A lot of this data is pulled from what you do, but look at 2020, median sales price was 287,000, and again, that's across the whole state, so that's urban and rural. And you look at 2024, and it's 384,000, so almost $100,000 increase in median price in a 4-year period. And there's no way that income, the wages kept up with that. And that goes back to, those changes in the volume. There's, lack of inventory and also just the affordability issue that goes on. And again, this is not just specific to, the urban metro areas. It's not a Northern Virginia, DC issue or Hampton Roads or a regional issue here. This is across the board. We go everywhere in Virginia, and I'll tell you, everywhere we go, it's an issue of housing affordability and housing accessibility. So to kind of get the bad stuff out of the way, and let's pivot to some things that we're seeing that are working well. And I'm going to be kind of a cheerleader for some of the folks in the room because there's just amazing work that's happening. I will say now, more than any other time in my career, we're seeing a lot more regional collaboration. And a lot of that really is due to the planning district commissions taking a lead role in driving conversations, convening organizations, and just, taking this housing issue head on. One thing we've seen that has been very effective in communities, particularly when you don't have a strong development capacity or you've got untested markets, are these housing summits. Basically, localities coming together to market themselves. They invite developers in, give the localities a chance to kind of show off, the quality of life, what they have available. They typically will bring employers in, so the employers can help validate that, yes, we need new housing, please, come to our area. And then funders, coming in like us and others to talk about ways that we can help facilitate development. So we've seen these happen in, the George Washington area, which is Fredericksburg, Eastern Shore, Southwest Virginia. Danville has actually done a couple of these, and they've been extraordinarily successful. They've even had some smaller focused ones around homeownership development. So, again, great ways that these have come together, and I would say, the regional commissions have played a strong role in making these successful. Market studies, again, shout out to the regional commission here. I think, we're gonna maybe look at doing some refresh of the data. But having these regional market studies are just so important because not only do they give us, the data, they substantiate, where the gaps are, where the price points are needed for new construction, maybe where some development areas could be targeted. They also come up with some recommendations of what could help to make communities more developer friendly. So looking at, maybe some land use recommendations or designating some ways to streamline permitting processes or identifying, publicly owned land that could be made available for development. These regional collaborations around, understanding the housing market have also been wonderful. It was mentioned earlier around the Planning District Commission grant. So a couple of years ago, we gave $40 million to all 21 of the regional commissions. So kind of two things, lessons on that, great unit production. I mean, we're gonna get 2,300 units out of that 40 million. So if you do the math, that's a great return on investment. That's fabulous, numbers are great, but what I've been more excited about, regional commissions did kind of really unique things, based on what their needs were. We saw regional commissions set up revolving loan funds, create regional housing trust funds, come in as gap financing. Some have actually started to do development work themselves because there's not real strong developer capacity in the region. So just some really cool things have come out of that, just not just in terms of getting more units on the ground, but just new models of how to do business. And I remember our leadership came over here, I think it was Martha, back in like January. And one of the things you said really struck me and stuck with me. It's like Martha said, what this allowed the regional commission to do is not just be at the table to help talk about the problem, but to have resources to go out and solve the problem. And to me, that was very impactful. And I will say that the commissions have done a wonderful job with that resource. This was talked about a little bit before in the last session, but we're seeing a lot of communities now, take on the messaging of housing head on. Because, when we go into communities, housing can certainly be a trigger word. All of a sudden there's discussion of public housing or subsidized housing, workforce, attainable housing, all these things. And, some of us who go out in the communities don't do ourselves any favor because we make it worse. We talk about median incomes and 60%, 80%. So, we are kind of refining our messaging, but we've seen, communities like this, the lower one was in Fauquier, Loudoun County, where they are doing this, community education and awareness building in their localities. The one above, which is also, I think, getting into the Richmond area, is HAND. And HAND does this housing indicator tool, which basically tells you, as you go along the continuum of salaries and professions, with the sales price going up, who gets really, cut out of your community. And, for us, the essential message is, we want housing options for everyone, whether it's someone working, in a hospital, whether it's a teacher, law enforcement, public service, retail. Those opportunities should be available for everyone. So entities like HAND do a great job, making some visual representation of what that looks like when you don't have affordable housing. this was another part that we've also seen very intentional, thoughtful community engagement. So Christina, this was up in kind of your area. So Alexandria, they've done great work, very diverse community. So when they are doing community engagement, they are making materials available in different languages. They're doing it at times that are appropriate for people in the neighborhood, not always, during the 9 to 5 time slot. And what's been really cool, like even about this example, is it gave the city the information they needed to create a new land use tool. So out of this came a new zoning designation that focused on preserving affordable housing and providing a density bonus for those who wanted to build more. So community engagement that also had this bonus of coming up with a new land use tool. And then moving into some different kind of housing structures. Manufactured housing is not always a fan favorite in communities, but from going around the state, I will say, it is a valuable part of the housing options that are available. And so you've got great work that's happened here in Chesterfield with Project Homes, going into a community and really redesigning units so that they maintain their value, they are durable, they're energy efficient, and extraordinarily, just aesthetically, they look great. So looking at some work like that, and then looking at how, manufactured housing for home ownership. So this is the cross mod, or I call it next generation. So it's, pitched roof, it's drywall throughout, you've got carports and garages. We did this pilot project in Danville for some infill housing. These homes were between 1,400, 1,600 square feet and selling for under 200,000. So great value. The two fabulous things about this is they're on permanent foundation. So they qualify as real property. So that means someone can get down payment assistance, closing cost assistance, regular mortgage like any other house. And appraisers have to use stick-built comps because these are built so close to the statewide building code that you use comps for stick-built. So again, you look at ways of achieving equity and growing wealth. So some great opportunities there. And this was just last weekend. This is actually manufactured in Virginia. It was this model has just been approved. It's a duplex for manufactured housing, first of its kind. So you look, there are different ways you can structure it. You can put them end to end, you can put them side by side, you could even stagger the doorways. And so these could be used for home ownership, they could be used for rental, could be used for a combination of rental and home ownership, like an ADU possibly. And so something like this, where you've got, basically 2 units is under 100,000. Doesn't, talk about land or anything else, but very affordable and innovative way of getting more housing out there. But in like we found in Danville and other places, zoning doesn't always accommodate manufactured housing. In fact, we had to go through a process to get the Planning Commission to approve a zoning overlay district to accommodate that cross mod, and then City Council had to approve it. And unfortunately, they were on board and were very supportive of it, but we do run into that barrier at times. And then the last thing I'll say, I know I'm running out of time, is that, also more than ever, we are seeing that connection of housing and economic development. So on the statewide level, we have our partners like Virginia Economic Development Partnership. We are sitting in on meetings with them when they're doing site selection. They're coming to us and asking for information in their marketing materials to talk about what's happening in communities. Because they say, employers who are looking to make location decisions used to talk about, okay, what's the education system look like? What's transportation look like? Now housing is really the driving conversation. So, we need to do more to get housing out there to be economically competitive. And then I would say kind of a nice other win that's come out of that is we're seeing more of our industrial development authorities and our economic development authorities come to the table, either looking at property they own that could be developed, and we've got a few that are actually acquiring properties, going through feasibility analysis, and they're actually going to be the developer. So some interesting new ways of developing capacity in our economic development world, again, to make Virginia and our communities more economically competitive. So with that, I'm gonna wrap up and turn it over to Jovan. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Javon Burton, Executive Director with the Partnership for Housing Affordability. So I'm going to kind of set the table for the subsequent presentations here today. PHA, for those of you who do not know, we're a regional nonprofit here in the Richmond region that works to advance housing through policy, education, and collaboration. Much of that is done with partnership with local governments, other housing stakeholders, and housing adjacent sectors. So I'll try to stay pretty high level, and the focus of this will be illustrating the why this issue is so essential to our region, the scale of it, the scope, and the urgency. So I'll just start big picture with our population trends. Here as a region, we're obviously growing, which is a great thing. Particularly in the last few years, we've seen a lot of growth from bordering areas. So if you look at just where the migration has come from, majority of that is domestic migration. So from surrounding states. Much of that was increased during the pandemic, so remote work was really beneficial for a lot of workers, but also for Richmond. And a lot of people who lived in higher cost areas relocated to Richmond while still having incomes from higher income areas. So that just increased the competitiveness that we have and demand for our already limited supply. So what does that mean for home prices here in the region? So here, some of our localities and the home price increases in the last few years, pretty steep. And I think, again, that's no surprise to most of you in the room, but it's to illustrate how quickly this is becoming unattainable for really the majority of our workforce, not just a small segment of our population. And I threw this in here because, and maybe a little difficult to read, but I think similar to the messaging that Chris was talking about and some of the tools that are out there, we have to do a better job in this space of talking about who this issue impacts, who stands to gain and who stands to lose. And so, we created this kind of continuum graphic that illustrates here in Richmond how many households are in these different income bands to demonstrate really the scope of this issue, and then the different kind of occupations. Of course, it's not exhaustive. There are literally thousands of different job occupations that are represented in these job groups. But I think it's important that we do a better job of illustrating who it impacts, and then also, on the other side, who can make a difference for each income band. Philanthropy is not going to be the most influential partner in this for every income band. They have to figure out where they fit. So does the corporate sector, so does local government, regional government, state government. So helping to identify that is kind of our role, and just really providing that education piece for folks that are interested in this issue. I'll show another chart that really kind of puts it in perspective, similar to what Chris did in the last 5 years. So this is a 5-year snapshot between 2017 and 2022. If you look at median home prices in the region, so that horizontal purple line, that represents the amount of income that you needed to afford median value home in Chesterfield, in Ranco, and the city of Richmond. So you can see that many occupations, it was well within reach, pretty attainable. Fast forward 5 years later, you can see the gap. And I think, again, oftentimes when people are unfamiliar with this issue and they don't know, kind of what we're talking about when we say affordable, what we're talking about when we say workforce, and they don't recognize that it's probably people that they interact with on a daily basis. And in this case, it's really the majority of our workforce that we rely upon to make our regions great. So that's the urgency of the need. That's how fast it's becoming more and more unattainable, particularly for first-time homebuyers. Here's another way to look at it. If you just take a look at the region on a map and where people can afford to live, where they can't afford to live based on income. So if you're a household that makes the median income, so about $97,000 for a household of 3, the blue areas indicate where you could afford to live, meaning where you would not have to spend more than 30% of your income on housing costs. And the yellow obviously indicating where you would be cost burdened if you chose to live there. If you went down to 50% of area median income, right, there's very few options. Now, does this mean that people at that income level are not living in the region? Obviously not. It just means that represents how many people are spending upwards of 30, 40, 50% of their income on housing costs, severely cost burden. So when you think about commute times, when you think about how we interact with each other as a region, folks that may work in one locality and live 50, 45 minutes away, a lot of this is exacerbated by high housing costs. So we're going to talk a little bit about zoning in the next presentations, I know. So just kind of to set the stage why this is important. When you think about lack of supply, the increased competitiveness for housing, we have a gap of around 40,000 units here in the Richmond region, which is pretty significant. Now, why is zoning important to that? If you look at all the jurisdictions here on the screen, around 5% of all that land area allows for multifamily development. So there's a lot of opportunity there, right? I think when you hear that, there's a lot of opportunity because there's a lot of zoning code conversations happening here in the region and different localities. And so to think about where housing options can be built, where we can develop to serve this need, zoning is a key lever for that. And it's one of the most powerful local levers that we have. I'll use another example. So between 1983 and 2011, about 14,000 acres of land was used for single-family development in Henrico County. I bring that up because typically there's a misconception that present day, we're building so much, and it really kind of pales into comparison of what we've done in previous decades, particularly in the 70s and the 80s. And so development is really not at the pace that it once was, and oftentimes that's what we're pushing back against in this space. Well, don't we have enough? Are we developing enough? There's more developments being announced every week, it feels like, to folks that don't work within this space. So it's important that we truly understand what's happening in perspective to previous decades and what we need to do still. So I don't think I need to show most of you all kind of examples of affordable housing products that have been built here in the region. Here's some examples that have been within the city, both of these being multifamily, LIHTC deals, low-income housing tax credit. And so that's the number one way that we can build multifamily housing for the income levels that we're talking about in the country. And I'll just finish with this because I think quality is another misnomer around this issue. This is an example, very small sample size of just some of the restrictions that you have to adhere to if you're going to build through the tax credit program that are must-haves. And this is, again, just a small sample of those. So anything that comes out of that program is going to be of incredible quality because they're competing with everyone else in different pools across the state of who has the best projects that are going to go through and get funded. So whenever you hear concerns about quality, many of these projects have to go through deals and hoops that market rate deals simply do not have to. So I think with that, I will turn it over to Kristen. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. All right. So my name's Tina Stacy. I'm an economist at the Urban Institute. I always say don't hold that against me though. So I'm going to be talking today about some land use reforms that have happened in Northern Virginia, and also just talking a bit about what the research says about what impact land use reforms are having across the nation, because we've seen a lot of them lately. And I will note I have to agree very wholeheartedly with some of the discussion in the last panel about the lack of real-time rental data. We're trying to work on that, but it really makes it hard to track this stuff in real time, but we're doing the best we can. So, I usually start these kinds of presentations with a bunch of data about what, like, the depth of the housing crisis that we're in right now. But you know what? No one needs to hear that. Everyone knows that. They can feel it every month when they pay their rent or their mortgage or whatever it is, or if they're looking at buying a new home. So I've started talking more about what we know about the positive benefits of housing affordability, not just on the people who are experiencing those high costs, but on our communities as a whole, right? And they're starting to become a richer evidence base around that. So for instance, we know that decreases in housing affordability have a negative effect on economic growth. We know that high housing costs are linked to recruitment and retention difficulties for public sector employers and certain types of private sector employers. So if I can't afford to live in an area, I'm not going to drive 2 hours to work at a minimum wage job, right? So employers should be thinking about this. This is super important if you want to retain your employees, attract and retain employees. And higher cost housing can trigger productive workers to leave markets and will limit the ability of people to enter your market as well. So it's really bad overall for many, many reasons. And I don't think anyone in this room needs to really be convinced of that. But so how do we increase affordability? I'm gonna give some examples from Northern Virginia, but there are a number of ways, and we'll say there's unfortunately no one silver bullet that's gonna solve this problem. And I should note, by the way, that when I do start this, I always also talk about the intersectionality of racial equity and housing affordability challenges. We know that as housing unaffordability has risen, this has really exacerbated a number of racial inequities, in addition to being combined with the COVID crisis. So something important to keep in mind, both as we're thinking about solutions, how they're targeted, and how we're tracking and measuring outcomes. So this is my friend's ADU. I'd like to give her a shout out when I do this. How cute is it, right? So Alexandria, a couple years ago, I got to be lucky enough to be part of a team that helped design an accessory dwelling unit regulation for the city of Alexandria, where I live. So we did an extensive community engagement process. Unfortunately, our first community meeting, I was in the room getting it set up. I had this clever idea to have crafts for the kids where they got to build little ADUs out of popsicle sticks, all ready to go. COVID, everything shut down, and we didn't get to have any in-person meetings. So everything had to be remote. We had to figure that out pretty quickly. But the city did a great job. I was working with the city of figuring out inclusive ways of still doing community engagement during that crisis. So Alexandria eventually, after this community engagement process and a lot of research, adopted an ADU policy in 2021 that allows one accessory dwelling unit per property, citywide, internal or detached. Limits occupancy to 3 persons or fewer. It has a bunch of size, setback, and height requirements for the ADUs. I will note, we tried as hard as possible to get these. One important thing for really helping bolster the ADU market is trying to have rules and regulations that are consistent across place. So we tried to make these rules to be in line with the current, not manufacturer, what's the term I'm looking for? The other term for manufacturer.
Modular?
Yeah, modular, there we go. Modular products on the market to try to make, so just something to think about if and when places are starting to think about adopting ADU regulations, trying to make things consistent across place and make it as easy as possible to get those on the market. And then it does not require off-street parking spaces, which was something, or did not, we were pretty proud of, because there's a lot of research showing, well, one, requiring off-street parking, you're increasing your impermeable surfaces and all of that stuff. But at the same time, it can make it really harder for lower income households or places with smaller lot sizes to be able to build an ADU at all. So parking, I'm gonna keep coming back to parking requirements because I think that's an easy low-hanging fruit. It's easy for me to say that, I don't have to do community engagement around it, but theoretically, it's a low-hanging fruit, especially if you pair it with transit investments. Council later amended the regulation to require homeowners to maintain primary residence in the ADU. I could go into that for a while. Pretty much what we've learned is that it's like an impossible to enforce rule that just causes problems and not a lot of good, but that happened. And they also amended it to prohibit the exclusive use of an ADU as a short-term rental, so you can't use a business for a long period. Required a fee and required larger setbacks for taller detached ADUs. So since 2021, there have been 62 ADUs approved, which is pretty good. There are some cities that have had ADU policies on the books for a long time and only have a couple ADUs built. So pretty proud of that. My partners in the city are pretty proud of it. I don't have anything to do with it. But move over to Arlington County, which is right next to Alexandria. A few years later, 2023, they passed a missing middle upzoning. Too much, much work, much discussion and debate. This reform allows smaller multifamily structures for missing middle, which is very confusing, right? Because I think when people hear missing middle, they think of like middle-sized buildings or middle income. It's tough, but it's allowing for duplexes, triplexes, those kinds of things in single-family detached homes, in neighborhoods with single-family detached homes. It offers an alternative to single-family residential lots that allows for the construction of these things that I was talking about, townhouses, multifamily buildings that meet design standards, right? And we're seeing this across the nation more. We know Minneapolis did this. Some people call it banning single-family zoning. No one's banning single-family zoning. You can still make single-family homes. But of course it is, you know, it's a big change and it takes a lot of discussion with community. So in Arlington, we know there were 25 approved permits in 2023 and 9 in 2024. So again, not like a ton, but I'm gonna talk about in a minute what other potential reforms could be paired with these or changes that could lead to more development. Then not long later, Alexandria, my city, also passed zoning for housing, which is a comprehensive package of zoning reforms, which also allows for this, you know, missing middle housing. They also just want to note that they have housing for all, which is the equity component, and explores the extent of past discriminatory housing policies and their continued impact, especially on people of color and people with low incomes. Sorry, I'm feeling dizzy for some reason, just looking at the PowerPoint. So Alexandria is doing a lot of work. Of course, again, I live there, so I'm biased and I'm proud, but doing a lot of work to think about, really deal with their past history of discriminatory housing practices and exclusionary zoning, and thinking about how to move forward and repair some of those things. So what this law changed, all the previous single family and single and two family zones now allow up to 4-unit buildings. But they do have to follow the exact same rules that those single family homes have to fulfill. So I'm gonna talk about that in a minute. That's something that you could relax as well if you wanna really make sure that these reforms lead to increased development. They changed the rules in the zones that allow townhouses to make it easier to build, made it easier to build them. There were some kind of things on the books that made it tough. They eliminated the off-street parking requirement for all houses with 4 or fewer dwellings in the city's enhanced transit area, so transit-oriented development. Again, that parking requirement seems to be a consistent theme we've seen across cities as something that really can make a big impact. You can reduce those requirements. More parking reductions to 0.5 spaces per dwelling unit, which I had to ask my friend, what does that mean? It just means you round up. So if it's 1 dwelling unit, you get 1 parking. You have to have 1 parking space. They eliminated the maximum density limit for multifamily buildings. You know, it's really important as we're thinking about these missing middle reforms. We also have to make more high density buildings in order to really be able to accommodate low income housing tax credit buildings and other types of affordable development. So thinking comprehensively about your housing all the way from size as well as income and who it's affordable to, and thinking about strategies that can hit all of those components is important. And then it changed open space requirements to be fairer and more flexible across the city zone. It's too soon to know what take-up will be. I've been told there have been no formal submissions for duplexes, but there have been inquiries. So just to circle back around to this debate. So do these work? Do these missing middle reforms work? What we know so far is that a lot of the places that have enacted missing middle reforms really haven't seen much missing middle development. Early research, for example, on Minneapolis's 2019 allowance or banning of single family zoning shows no conclusive difference in total units and multifamily units permitted after the policy was implemented, right? We're not seeing a ton of uptake, but you know what? It could be just because we need to do a little more, right? So the reforms may lack the necessary additional zoning changes to make multifamily development feasible, right? You might need to allow for smaller setbacks, more floor to area ratio at FARs, larger FARs, all sorts of things that can accompany that to make it just a little bit more profitable to redevelop it to multifamily. There are lawsuits in all 3 cities, which can create a lot of risk for builders. High mortgage rates we all know about right now, and market uncertainty could just be hindering development overall. And then developers may be unable to make a profit when tearing down a single family home. That's really related to the first component, but just might take time, right? It might take time for it to be feasible to turn stuff over. And like I said, other reforms have seen some success. In some prior research we did, this is just one of my favorite quotes. This guy who was both a developer and a landlord, he said to us, listen, like 40 years ago, when I first started being a contractor, I could walk into the county building with a plan that was basically 3 pages and walk out with a permit for $200, right? Now it takes at least 4 to 6 months and $30,000. Obviously that's gonna hinder development, right? So thinking about how we can make these processes smoother, quicker, and less costly is really important as well for increasing supply. Removing parking minimums, like I mentioned, fast tracking permitting for affordable housing, Boston's doing a lot around that, and then simplifying the development process to the best of the ability that cities can is important. And then even with high take-up, there's a lot of other economists out there who think, we might be overselling upzonings, right? They're not gonna solve everything. They might be able to help. But we wanna make sure that we're being clear that, you still have to think about your continuum of housing. You need to think about your continuum of tools that you can use to create a good housing ecosystem, right? So with upzonings, builders might convert existing lower cost buildings, so they might go into neighborhoods that are already gentrifying, tear down older buildings and build, $1 million condos. That's a possibility, right? So thinking about how if we're gonna do an upzoning, how can we go in and enact anti-displacement policies to ensure that people aren't getting displaced out of those communities. And again, this intersects with the racial equity component I was mentioning. Thinking about that, thinking about inclusionary zoning, other tools that can be used, TOPA, Tenant Opportunity Purchase Acts, ability for tenants to purchase their building if it's being sold, all those kinds of things. So anti-displacement measures are something important to think about pairing with upzonings. Upzonings also might increase all land value. So when you upzone a city, suddenly every piece of land becomes more valuable. If you did it right, if you didn't, then there's not gonna be any development, right? But if you did it right, then theoretically that land becomes more valuable. So you have to think about how you're creating companion policies or investing in affordable housing at the same time that you're dealing with this supply issue. And then upzoning might induce new demand, right? You might get more demand in the city that might counter that supply. So really thinking about how you're creating supply in a way that's targeted at the people who need it and not really inducing demand overall and maybe counteracting some of these policies. Okay, so what does this all mean? Sorry, I think I'm taking too much time. So what the evidence says so far, and there still needs to be a lot more research, is that reforms loosening restrictions or upzoning areas can increase housing supply, but it's likely inadequate to increase the availability of housing affordable to low and middle income households in the short term, right? So we still really need to address that now. And there may even be some increases in prices in the short term in certain communities, right? So just thinking about how can we put a bunch of different policies together to really address all of these, both short-term, long-term, and then the continuum of affordability across incomes. So our recommendation at this point, also shout out to Alexandria, I'm on the board of the Affordable Housing Developer. This is one of our buildings where the first floor is a homeless shelter and above it is affordable housing. It's a beautiful building and I like how you're literally could move up and it's right by transit. So just, leaders, at this point with the evidence that we have, I think the recommendation I would personally give is that should consider pairing direct investments in affordable housing, such as LIHTC, more, public assisted housing, that's gonna be more of a federal issue, but with the reforms loosening land use restrictions to address both short-term and long-term housing affordability. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hi, Dan Rosenzweig, and so I want to start by us getting real with each other. Y'all ready for that? So raise your hand, don't be shy, if you're even just a little bit excited about this being the last presentation. Come on, we're getting real with each other, help me out here. Well, the good news is I'm going to tell you a story of success. So we've heard a lot of data about the housing crisis, the supply crisis in the United States, and it impacts everywhere. And so I'm going to talk to you about how we in Charlottesville, I think have set the stage to move. There we go. And so you might be wondering, why is the CEO of a Habitat for Humanity talking about zoning? We build houses with volunteers, right? Well, we're a pretty successful Habitat. We are in fact the most productive Habitat affiliate for our service area in the world. We worked on 101 homes this past year, finishing selling 57 and rehabbing 20 more. We also were the first Habitat in the country to do neighborhood development and specifically mixed income development. So now we've either built or built in 14 mixed income developments. And we were the first anybody to transform a mobile home park into a mixed income development without any resident displacement. So we had some success, but you know what? We looked in the mirror in 2016 and said, we asked a different question. What if we were doing What if what we're doing just isn't enough? And what would it look like to create a housing system? Somebody asked a question earlier today, actually, it was an observation that here a generation later, we're talking about the same stuff, right? Well, we know that this is true, especially in the housing sector. We are a generation or two behind. Not since the GI Bill have we had a federal housing policy that truly invests in the kind of supply that's necessary to meet demand. We all know that, right? So we at Habitat 2016 said we could go through enormous efforts to scale up further, to build a few more houses, to quadruple our production, but that isn't gonna change the conditions that cause housing poverty in the first place. So we have to look bigger than that. And so we developed a strategic plan that really has us operating in 3 realms. The first is building. You all know what we do in the building realm. We build houses in neighborhoods, and rebuilding. We do critical home repair, but also we do whole cloth developments and redevelopments of neighborhoods like Southwood, the mobile home park we're working in right now, which was 317 families and mobile homes. It will be an 1,100 unit mixed income development without resident displacement that's inclusive of a neighborhood scale downtown anchored by resident owned businesses. That's house 2, but the one where we're actually making the biggest impact, I think, at scale, is we call it house 3 or housing system development. What is that? I don't know. We're figuring that out. We're trying to figure out what the needs are in the community. And bring solutions, housing solutions, not affordable home ownership, not habitat solutions, but housing solutions writ large that create a continuum of opportunity so that no matter who you are, what income you are, what you look like, how tall, short, whatever, where you come from, you can step out of your home or out of your car and you can find a housing solution that works for you. It's called a housing a ladder of opportunity, and we will not rest until that happens. And so one of the things we started looking at in our advocacy and policy development work was zoning in the city of Charlottesville. And for 50, 60, 70 years in Charlottesville, it was pretty uncontroversial, and zoning was more or less a matter of faith. It was the thing that protects you against the bad things, right? Zoning is what allows you to protect the interest of your home, of the lot that you live in, of your investment, and that's a big deal. But zoning over the course of the past 50 to 70 years has truly become a tool of exclusion and separation in a way that it wasn't ever really meant to be. Zoning was supposed to, at the most basic level, it was supposed to separate noxious uses like factories from residential uses. But the world is different. There aren't that many urban noxious uses anymore. So we can live a little bit more mixed. And what zoning has done has created residential segregation where zip code really defines where you're probably likely gonna go. And that was certainly true in the city of Charlottesville. What you're looking at is our zoning map, and I'll carry this one, I can point stuff out. The zoning map probably looks a lot like the zoning map in your city. The lighter color is the least intensive use, and you can see in Charlottesville, yellow is single family use, R1, and it was for the better part of our existence since the advent of zoning in the late 50s, it was 70%, it's been about 70% of our land mass has been R1. Pretty non-controversial, because that's kind of the way it's always been, or the way people have felt it's always been. But then something happened in Charlottesville. This was 2017, this is in my neighborhood. This was in a place where my kids used to play barefoot, right? Where we were marched on by Nazis and white supremacists. And we decided that in the genteel community of Charlottesville had better start talking honestly and seriously about things, about the systemic reasons why we're as divided as we are, why it was so threatening to people from all over the country and all over the world that we were gonna take down statues, that they decided to come and riot and maul our community. And so we started asking ourselves fundamental questions. Why is it that we have 3 good schools in Charlottesville and 3 rough schools in Charlottesville? 3 schools where there's very little incidence of free and reduced lunch, and 3 schools where it's very, very high, well above the national average, and the educational outcomes are below average. And so we started looking at the things that separated us, that created the conditions that caused separation in the first place. What you have circled there, this again, this is my neighborhood adjacent to downtown. For most of its history, it's been an R1 neighborhood. It was created as an R1 neighborhood. And in one of the properties, this was the deed that restricted the sale of the house. I was shocked when my wife and I bought our house in this neighborhood and we went to close. This language was in our deed, except for ours actually added in, you can't be Jewish either. They had to throw that in for good measure. Well, so a few years ago, a heroic journalist named Jordy Yeager in Charlottesville said, well, let's actually look at this. Let's look at the data. He went to the courthouse day after day after day and just started pulling every deed in the city and found that the vast majority of the homes that were created as R1 in the city of Charlottesville were created with this deed restriction. Now, it's not legal to enforce them anymore, but it's still the law. It's still the law. It just can't be enforced because of civil rights legislation or fair housing legislation in the 60s. So again, let's peel the onion skin back a little bit further. You're looking at another map. Has anyone ever heard of the planner named Harlan Bartholomew?
Yes.
I want to hear some groans. So Harlan Bartholomew was a star planner who usually mostly traveled to small southern cities. He came to Richmond. And he would walk around neighborhoods with city and civic leaders and he would point out the neighborhoods that were good neighborhoods. Oh yeah, this is a good neighborhood. Look at it. The housing stock's great. It's got nice trees. And then he'd walk through the other neighborhoods and say, this is a bad neighborhood. You know, it's got deteriorating housing stock, and he would mark them as ones that are in need of redevelopment, ones that need to be knocked down. And he'd draw these maps, and the ones that had the circles around them, the darkest hatching, well, those are the ones that just had to come down because the physical stock was just kind of degraded. Let me point out a couple of things. This is the Star Hill neighborhood of Charlottesville. And it was one of those neighborhoods that Harlan Bartholomew walked through and said, gotta get rid of this. It was ramshackle, it was rough. It was almost 100% black owned. If there were rentals, they were rentals that were rented by African-American landlords to African-American residents. There were shops underneath homes. But yeah, it was in rough shape. But let me tell you something else about that neighborhood. Over time, the city had extended water and sewer to everything else around it and not Star Hill. So what do? What was our response? That's actually where my Habitat offices are now. This is a different area, but was hatched dark by Harlan Bartholomew. This was called the Bottoms Land. There was a lot of black-owned businesses. There was a brothel down there. There was, it was a little bit rough. We tore it down. If you look at a map, an aerial map, a figure plane map of the city of Charlottesville, you'll see super blocks that are just empty, surrounded by beautiful gridded streets and all the other neighborhoods. And we just demolished big chunks of the city. And on the housing side, we built a ton of public housing. We built 350 units of public housing or so. And so at the time, although there were some leaders that warned against this, I said, look, this is a deal with the devil. The housing stock was a little bit better than what people lived in, but we essentially removed African-American wealth. We wiped it off the face of the planet in Charlottesville and put people in temporarily what would seem like better housing. And here's the scary part. Look at that. Bartholomew's map and the zoning map is the same map. For all intents and purposes, it's the same map. So when we sort of talk about naturally occurring segregation in neighborhoods, when we talk about zoning and simply encapsulating, a good zoning practice, I would encourage everybody who deals in planning, everybody who's a neighborhood activist, everybody who cares about a more just, equitable, and inclusive society, to look at your own zoning code and examine some of what went on beneath it. But 2017 forced us to wake up a little bit. For 8 years, I was chair of the Planning Commission in Charlottesville. They were usually pretty tame events. After I got off, thankfully, activists started noticing the nexus between land use and segregation exclusion in Charlottesville and said no more. This is what we did in Charlottesville. We actually paused the comprehensive planning and update, in the state of Virginia every 5 years, you have to look at your comprehensive plan and update it. A lot of municipalities will just, open up, yep, we looked at it, close it again. Some will do a comprehensive update. We weren't scheduled for one, but we said, look, we can't, after 2017, we can't just go through business as usual. And so what had been proposed prior to the tragedies of 2017 was a future land use map that was, it went parcel by parcel. There were a few parcels that planners had said, this one probably should be higher density, this one should be downzoned, et cetera. But it was just one of those run-of-the-mill every 5-year updates. And then after 2017, we got a little bit more aggressive, or the Planning Commission got a little bit more aggressive, and you see where there's some light brown in those other than the two maps as you're looking at it on the right. Those were proposed as sort of missing middle housing. Ability to go a little higher, ability to go a little bit denser. What happened? We lost our minds. Predictably, there was a lot of yelling and screaming and another civil war like we'd like to have in Charlottesville. And this is what the projections were. You're gonna ruination. You're gonna just dump people on top of each other. And this wasn't this kind of overcharged rhetoric wasn't exclusive to the NIMBYs, to the upper income neighborhoods. It was also a fear of people in low income neighborhoods too, because a lot of redevelopment had happened on their backs as well. And so we and some partners of ours at Piedmont Housing Alliance, a really great organization in Charlottesville, we started listening. And I had this amazing experience where I went to my neighborhood association. There was an emergency meeting called. And like for an hour and a half, these people were my neighbors who I love. These people help us raise our kids. We're talking about how our neighborhood's gonna lose its character, oh no. And it was gonna be ruined. But the thing that I did hear in just about everybody's tale of woe and fear was, we don't mind affordable housing, we want affordable housing to come to our neighborhood. We just don't wanna do something that's gonna create change without bringing affordable housing. And so we said, okay, so we listened. And what we heard is people love housing, they love affordable housing, they love Habitat. We have got a really good reputation. They welcome, generally speaking, we have YIMBYs for Habitat in our community. They want our housing in their neighborhoods. And so we actually proposed something kind of radical that dealt not just on the supply side, but on the demand side. So Tina talked about the data that says in Minneapolis, just opening up zoning to try to increase supply hasn't really worked. Well, we said, well, maybe we can build on what people in neighborhoods said and get community consensus around the idea that let's allow housing, more housing, if and only if some of it's affordable. And so we proposed a citywide overlay that basically said, and this was a pretty radical idea, and it didn't win. It didn't, but we proposed an idea that we actually kind of base downzone the whole city, but said you can go way the heck up, if and only if the first unit or a few units are affordable. And that seemed to gain community consensus. So this is what has 70% of the land mass in Charlottesville. This was the land use. This is what had been proposed in the future land use map update that got everybody jazzed up. And this is what we proposed. As long as your first one's affordable, then let's let people make money off the development. Let's let it cross-subsidize and pay for itself. That didn't carry the day, but in 2021, the Charlottesville City Council did pass a historic update of the future land use map that's based on an affordable housing plan. So we actually said, let's don't go right to zoning or even the land use map. Let's deal with an affordable housing plan that's separate from that, and let's figure out what the community vision is about equity and inclusion. And so we came up with a really robust housing plan. But the rule from City Council was that then our comprehensive plan, our land use map, has to be based on that housing plan. That's got to be the presiding document that breaks ties, right? And then we'll create a zoning code that's reflective of that. And so 2023, City Council passed a citywide zoning ordinance that in my mind, and I'm not an expert on this, but in my mind, I haven't seen a more progressive zoning code in the country. Now, we can't, we were able to do it because the Minneapolises of the world did something a little bit more straightforward. They were the early adopters who said, look, let's look at density. But we did something that was a little bit more progressive, I think. And it's gonna work on the demand side. That's gonna help the existing housing stock or the new housing stock that's created benefit people who struggle most to find housing. And so this is the new zoning ordinance, and this is the 70% of the city that's still the lowest intensity use. Whereas previously, again, this is what you could do on 70% of the land mass in Charlottesville. This is what you can do by right if you tear down the building, you get an extra unit. If you maintain the original, so that helps to preserve the character of the neighborhood. So this is a lot of what you'll see under that ordinance, is a single home that will be divided up into 1 or 2 or 3 homes. But also what we overlaid, and we did successfully get a citywide affordable housing overlay, is that if you provide affordable housing, you get another 2 units. So now affordable housing provider like Piedmont Housing Alliance or Habitat, or even a private builder where the numbers make sense, can maybe do something like this on a lot that makes sense. Now we do have setback restrictions and whatnot, but we actually loosened that up as well. We created a form-based code that softened that quite a bit. And this is something I'm really proud of because people talked about displacement in the last session. And so we were very sensitive to that too, because we heard from the lower income neighborhoods that we don't want this to happen on our backs. Actually, I'm sorry, we also created RB, the area that had been brown, as the sort of missing middle housing. So kind of on the where it makes a little bit more sense, a little bit more density. So you'll start to see a lot of this happening kind of on the edges of neighborhoods in Charlottesville. But then here's something that I think is really, really important that we're piloting, and we think it's gonna work, but we don't know, to be honest with you. We used census data to track the neighborhoods that are lowest income, that have the highest proportion of people who have been poor there for a long period of time, the people who usually suffer when gentrification happens. And we actually throttled down the allowable usage by right in those neighborhoods. So we've turned zoning on its head. Think about the Bartholomew map that led towards upzoning black neighborhoods that we torn down, where those are now those historically have been the highest density and intensity areas, where everything else is the most minimal. We flipped that on its head and said, okay, the neighborhoods that get extra protection are the ones that have the most gentrification pressure. But we still want people to be able to make use of their asset. So it did, if you maintain the original unit, somebody who maybe has struggled to own a home in a neighborhood can build an accessory building or can build a second unit and rent it out or sell it. So you'll start to see some of that stuff in the historically lower income neighborhoods. But people also in those neighborhoods say, we actually don't mind density, but we don't want to become a minority in our own neighborhood. And so in the RNA neighborhoods, it's an unfortunate name, but you can go up to 6 as long as 4 of them are affordable. And so you'll start to see a lot of that in Charlottesville's neighborhoods. You'll start to see homes that are fairly large, subdivided into 3, 4, 5, 6 apartments, as long as most of them are deed restricted as affordable. And so here's some of the other components of the ordinance. We've sort of restored the missing middle. There is an affordable housing density bonus on every parcel in the city. So even in our higher density districts, I think you can go by right to like 120 feet. You can go to like 180 if the extra stories that you get have to be affordable. And we did it with economic data, and we tried to make it so that it actually was something that would be taken up by developers. We tried to create enough incentive so that it would actually pay for itself. Here are some of the firsts. This is the first zoning code in the state of Virginia with mandatory inclusionary zoning. It's first to provide bonus density for affordability on every single parcel in the city. It's the first in Virginia, I believe, to allow multifamily in all districts and also eliminate all parking requirements. There are no more parking requirements in the city of Charlottesville. The market will set that. what the right amount is, but they're not required. And so here's some of the things that are next. We're doing some pilot projects and we're finding out that some of the things that we thought about in terms of zoning setbacks, in terms of some of the nuts and bolts, the technical requirements, may not align with just the basic envelope, with just the basic allowance for density. So we know that within a year, we're gonna have to go back and make a lot of changes to the code. And here's the thing I'm most proud of and I'm most bullish on, is that we're looking to create synthetic TIFs that are hyper-localized tax increment financing areas where if a neighborhood, let's say a low-income neighborhood, starts to receive more tax revenue because of building, half of that money stays in that neighborhood and is provided to the neighborhood association to spend it in their neighborhood how they see fit. It doesn't go generally to the city. It goes so that if this neighborhood wants a park, this neighborhood wants a grocery store, this neighborhood wants affordable housing, they have the money to do it. Haven't gotten there yet, that's what we're working on this year. And so that's kind of what we've done.
I think by my book, we started about 10 minutes late. So we might have a little extra time with your good graces to be able to ask questions. We've got about 20 minutes, I
Yep.
guess.
So if I could just get everyone up here and then we'll just, okay, I'll just talk loud for the moment. And then if you've got questions, raise your hand and I'll bring the mic around. Start right here.
Hey there, Hunter Nima, I'm an urban planner. And we've talked a lot about a lot of different mechanisms. We've talked about low-income tax credits, we've talked about loans, we've talked about zoning reformation in upzoning and parking elimination. So I want to ask all four of you, in your experience, if you could sort of briefly talk to which of those tools you think act best as Band-Aids and which act best to address the underlying drivers.
Someone there want to start?
I can take that. I mean, it's hard. I feel like that's how I used to think about, we haven't said anything about rent control, so I don't wanna bring in another controversial topic that's really hard to talk about in a simple way because it's so complex. But I mean, I'm not so sure it's Band-Aid versus solution anymore. I used to think of it like that, like we need to solve the underlying supply crisis, and that's the deep root, right? But I think what we're seeing both in practice and in the research is that while we know what got us here, it's all the exclusionary zoning and all the things we've heard about, all the history of redlining and all those things, that reversing it isn't as easy as putting it in place, right? And when we try to reverse it, we actually cause some new problems that are potentially, and again, we're still not 100% sure, but still are potentially harmful for people with low incomes and renters who, because of our history of racism and the housing market, are disproportionately people of color, right? So this is a long way to say, I don't think of them as Band-Aids anymore. I think of them as necessary complements to zoning reforms. But there are still some concerns that some of these policies could be actually harming the underlying crisis, like if you think about rent control, and maybe that's harming supply. And so I think we just need still a lot more research and evidence and monitoring of these things as they're happening to try to, and adapting them as we go, which can also be hard in the housing market because the more you adapt things, the more uncertainty there is for developers, so they might develop less. Although to say, I think we're still experimenting and trying to figure it out. But I think of them more now as complements than Band-Aids.
So I think you had a slide in your recommendations talking about pairing it with investments. So I think that's how they're gonna be most effective. What we learned is that on their own, it's not gonna move the needle incredibly much in terms of affordability. It may address supply, but it's not gonna inherently address affordability. So if you compare those zoning changes with investments in affordable housing, that's where you're gonna have the most impact. So, a great example, recently, Henrico was looking at how to use its new housing trust fund to also pair that with incentives around like fee waivers and density bonuses, et cetera. Those on their own, though, are gonna have to be market specific, so if you're in a jurisdiction that already allows you to build as high as you can, or as you want to, the density bonus obviously isn't gonna be of any value. So I think it's really kind of thinking about what's gonna move the needle. It's not gonna be one thing, and then if it's paired with investments, that's where they're gonna be most impactful.
I would agree with both of those things. I think one of the places where we fail as an affordable housing, or even really as a housing community across the country, is we keep looking for a silver bullet. How do we get out of this mess? Well, we got in this mess over the course of 50, 60 years by not investing in housing and by doing things that were actually undermining the production of housing and cutting off the supply that was there to people in the country. One of the things that started our work in Charlottesville was we looked overall at the housing sector from at every so data helps, but we saw that there was a real barbell effect, that what our market wasn't producing was $1 million condos or affordable homes. And so if you only invest in affordability, but you don't invest in affordable $1 million condos, or don't let that happen, then what happens? People who can afford that will push into the middle income sector and create supply constraints there as well. So we tend to overinvest in one thing. My own personal opinion is we overinvest we see things like LIHTC right now as the magic bullet. LIHTC is great. I'm a big fan of LIHTC, but it serves one segment of the market. The folks at the mobile home park, for example, that we're working with, they can't afford LIHTC. It doesn't pencil. Their incomes won't allow them to afford LIHTC. But we're building LIHTC in our development so that we can create on one site a holistic housing ladder of opportunity. So we have to keep investing, and we actually have to change hearts and minds. It's only now, for the first time in my lifetime, is housing policy being talked about at the federal level. A really, really, really protean way, in a Congress that's dysfunctional, in a government that probably is a couple of years away at least from being able to pass anything meaningful. But we have to make housing front and center.
And the last thing I'll add on to that is also kind of to the investment discussion, because, if you look at what we're trying to do, this housing is a market failure. I mean, most developers are gonna go to where they can get a good return on investment. So what can we do to help incentivize the other side of that coin? And if you look around the Commonwealth, there are not many localities that invest in housing. There are very few things like housing trust funds. Even if you look at the Commonwealth has seen a dramatic increase in how much money has been invested in housing through like the Virginia Housing Trust Fund. But that's something that still has to be negotiated every 2 years through a budget cycle. There's not a dedicated source of funding for that. So even though we've seen these, historic investments, there's still not a, guaranteed source. So we don't know year to year what that's going to look like, and that's at the state level and then at the locality level. So I think we still need to get to a point of where we're prioritizing investments in housing just like we do in so many other sectors.
Hey, my name is Wyatt Gordon. I work for Virginia Conservation Network. I was just kind of curious, Arlington, Alexandria, Charlottesville have gotten a lot of controversy for some of their upzonings. I've seen Norfolk has taken a different approach where they've been changing single-family only zoning to residential and then allowing missing middle to be built there as long as it conforms with the city's pattern book. So they kind of have a set layout of floor plans from duplexes, I think up to sixplexes, they call them Norfolk six-pack, that are then automatically approved. So it kind of reduces the permitting time. I was just wondering if you guys have any thoughts or data about that. It seems like a way that has, I haven't heard any real controversy as the city has been doing this, and I also don't know how effective it is. So I was just curious if you know anything about that as a different approach to the more controversial way.
No, that makes me want to learn about it, as I cannot pronounce Norfolk right. I did it, yeah. No, that's awesome, I want to read about it. I'm not sure, I'll have to learn about that.
I mean, I think the general tactic of setting out what can be approved by right is a good one. I mean, most builders don't wanna build crummy stuff, right? But they also they also can't afford the uncertainty and the risk of a 6-year special use permit process. So being able to go in and pull a permit, it's helpful and without knowing the granular details as a developer and builder myself, trying to build into something that's prescribed is good on the permitting side, but it might not be good on the economic side. It might not, and from my perspective, we work really intensively with families to find out what they want. And so cutting and pasting them into the limited pattern book might have some downsides, but I think it seems to me like there's 2 sides to that, one really good and one potentially limited.
Just to add to that it kind of fits into that story is one thing I haven't heard talked a lot about today, but I came late, so it might have come earlier. It's when modular development and just the lack of innovation that there's been in construction over the past 100 years, right? We haven't seen innovation like we've seen in other fields, and a lot of that is because of these specific requirements of the federal government saying, you want to put those 2 pieces of wood together, here's 3 ways you could do it. You can't innovate. And so like the more we can also allow for innovation to lower costs, that can also help with this construction. And so it's like a double-edged sword on that side though, because in one way it is getting to that, like here's very specific ways you can adapt modular, but I just think there's a lot of progress being made there that isn't, you hear about, I guess, modular has taken off in other countries much more than in the US, and tell me you guys would know better than I do since I'm not an actual houser, but partially because I guess like modular slowly evolved in other countries, it slowly got introduced into housing, whereas here people have tried to go from nothing to 100, and people don't like the way modular looks now because it doesn't look the same as the rest of our housing. And so I think that's just another opportunity for ways that we can think about how to get more modular into more supply is by lowering costs or allowing more modular development.
Other questions? Yeah.
You spoke to inclusionary zoning as a tool that Charlottesville has. It's a tool that most of the other localities in this room do not have. Were you a part of that process of changing state law? Do you have any insight on how we can encourage that and make those changes occur?
I wasn't part of the process of changing state law. What I was part of the process was getting our planning district commission to have that as one of our legislative priorities every year in Richmond, and then working with our senator and our delegate to make sure that they sponsored bills and that they fought for it. And so we got the similar enabling legislation that Arlington or Alexandria has, I think in 2020, 2021, something like that.
Other questions from the panel? Skip to the guys back.
Please do.
Thank you. A very nice presentation. I would like to learn more about the Norfolk six-pack though. It's very interesting. A question, and also Charlottesville, those maps you showed us, I think they're very impressive and forward-looking. My question to the ADU side of things, and also because Richmond has also recently adopted a ADU policy. So from the upward mobility framework perspective, we are not helping somebody generate what? It's still a rental unit. We're improving maybe supply at some lower cost levels, but there are still gonna be the power dynamics between who lives as a landlord, who lives as a renter, and you're not building wealth. To some extent, the scholar in me thinks like, hey, maybe this is a gateway to all the NIMBYs that have been happening, the market penetration, as you call, because you cannot have zoning changes in a locality, but you enter as a ADU, a very harmless looking thing. Can it grow? Will it grow into something really substantial in the future? Or it'll just stay like this?
You mean will a zoning reform that allows for ADUs grow into? You know, I have the same question, and whenever I'm talking with local leaders and they're considering ADU regulations, it's like, or ADU allowances, I don't, it's like, it's such a drop in the bucket in most places, right? ADUs are such a drop in the bucket and they're often not super affordable, and depending on how the law is designed, might not even be possible for low-income homeowners to build ADUs, right? They might not have enough land size, the ADUs are often not big enough for families, you know, and so I always wonder that too. I'm like, is it better to ease in with this gentle density, everyone loves that term, of ADUs and get people used to this idea? Or are you using all your political capital on ADUs when you should be like focusing on something bigger? I don't know the answer to that. It's something I wonder, and I'm sure the local leaders in the room would probably have responses and thoughts on that. But I often wonder, like, is it worth putting all of that? I mean, I was leading a lot of those community meetings and I got called a lot of names. So is it worth using all that political capital on something that might not make a huge difference? I don't know, good question.
Dan, I could ask directly, you were incorporating some ADUs into Southwood, right? Any comment about, are they being used for rentals or for economic, work opportunities? What's the plan there?
Thanks for asking, Chris.
Yeah.
So at our large mobile home park that we're working with right now, one of the things that was wonderful about the neighborhood that was sustaining and brought energy and life and wealth to the neighborhood was that there were 90 resident-owned businesses operating out of trailers. And so in working with side by side with residents to redevelop the neighborhood, we didn't want to kill the neighborhood, kill the economic development. So we actually worked as part of rezoning. We created both a form-based code, but also a new definition in the county zoning code that changed ADU to flex unit structure. And so now you can do just about anything you want in there. And so the taqueria that was operating out of somebody's kitchen, now they actually have income from that, so they can actually buy up above and beyond what you think they'd be able to buy. They can buy an ADU or a flex unit structure on their lot. So some people are gonna use it as taquerias, they're gonna be little tiendas, flower shops, and some people use it traditionally as a low-income rental, some people use it as a mother-in-law suite, some people just want a little bit more room. So that's what we tried to do. I will say that citywide in the city of Charlottesville, we were one of the early adopters of ADUs, and there was a dull trickle. It was a couple here and there, and it was mostly used for in-laws, which is a great thing, but it didn't really address the challenge. Once a couple started getting built, and this was 10 years ago before lots of stuff happened in Charlottesville. I remember sitting on the planning commission when we essentially downzoned the ADUs and made them be a smaller floor area ratio than had been before, relative to the main structure and everything, which was going in the wrong direction. We've pretty much eliminated ADUs by having a sublot ordinance. And so now across the city, you can divide your as I showed you, you can divide your lot into multiple sublots that can be sold fee simple. So you can use them as ADUs or you can sell them.
So maybe two more questions. We've one here and one up front.
Yeah, I was just curious when you were talking about some of the differences in buildings. One of the reasons I've heard that in other countries, they do their building kind of based off of performance. So if you can prove the performance of a material, they say, it needs to be this flame resistant, it needs to be this strong for winds, then it gets approved. Whereas in America, we're very prescriptive of like, you must use this type of joint or this type of wood. Do you know if there's any kind of conversation about changing that to be more performance-based to allow more innovation?
There is attempting to be conversation at the federal level for that. I know that because one of my colleagues at Urban is now the assistant one of the crazy secretary names at HUD. I was just at a conference with him about this not too long ago, and they're trying to have conversations. Did you read that article this week? Was it New York Times? Yep, it's a great article. If anyone hasn't read it, there's a great article that summarizes all of this. Was it New York Times? Washington Post? I can't remember. But they're trying to change stuff. I mean, but we can't even get like housing considered as infrastructure, right? So it's not in IJA. So it's a conversation. Yeah, it's evolving, but I hope it goes further because I do think that's a big component of this to the cost.
There's a question up here, maybe?
I'm just curious if there is a significance to second homes and if that is impacting the market in Richmond or in Virginia generally. I know there was a lot of articles out during COVID about people buying their pied a terre or a place in the country, and if that is statistically significant or impacting us.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I was just reading a paper today that was arguing that that's not the problem, but I haven't seen the data myself. That was from folks out of the Furman Center at NYU, they're great housing researchers. I'm trying to remember exactly what their argument was for why they were saying that that wasn't as much of a concern, because they're still arguing that supply is the main constraint and that this is more on like the efficiency of uses argument, that it's not as big of an issue, but I'd have to look at it.
Go ahead. I think a bigger issue right now that we're seeing is less the second home, although that's historically been a challenge in Charlottesville because hedge fund managers from New York bring their buying power down to the closest beautiful area that's warmer, right? Charlottesville has long kind of suffered from that, or at least the county around Charlottesville. But we're finding, we tried to come up with, when interest rates were lower, we were trying to pilot a Habitat Without the House program, basically where we would bring what we do really well to the table, housing counseling, helping people improve their credit scores, bringing partnerships together, and to solve second mortgage to help people buy up into the starting home market. What we are finding is that hedge funds, national hedge funds are because interest rates are so high, they're coming in and making all cash offers to a lot of the inventory that's on the market. And we can't compete with that. What we might have to do is actually raise money and come up with our own fund so that we can scarf up properties and then resell them.
And what, I've observed is it's not so much second homes, it's short-term rentals.
Yes.
That's pulling a lot off the market now, for obvious reasons, it can generate a lot of income, but making a really hard impact on local markets.
Just on the counter on that, it's interesting, short-term rentals, I think there's still a lot of research that needs to be done on those, but we also heard the other side of the short-term rental argument, specifically with ADUs, but beyond that, is that short-term rentals can also help lower income households purchase homes if they are allowed to, especially to build ADUs, right? It's really hard to build an ADU, there's not a lot of financing mechanisms out there. And so if you're able to rent it a little bit, short-term rental for just a little bit of time, then that can help some lower income households break into that market. So it's a complicated issue, so I just raise that because there's two sides of the coin on the short-term rentals.
And I'll just say last point that to the comment around investment activity, if you're interested in what that looks like in Richmond, you can look at the market value analysis tool that's on the PlanRVA site and just kind of see that it's mainly concentrated in a lot of lower income areas where there's been a lot of disinvestment, so I think that's probably a larger problem.
Well, I wish we had much more time, but I see this as the beginning of a conversation that we are all having in our region. And we as PlanRVA have lots of resources. PHA has lots of resources. We have had some really good examples, and these are, this has all been recorded, so it's on YouTube for the CM credits that AICP can offer. I really appreciate everyone's time today. It was really enlightening for us, and we look forward to continuing this discussion as we go forward. Thank you all.
I realize I just like to let.
That's a cool, I realized I stepped over.
I love it.
Yeah, I'm just leaving it.
I think
There's no car.
Recognize that.
Yeah.